Welcome to the Parent Doctor podcast, where adults who are parents come to learn, lead with love, and grow. Hello, and welcome to the Parent Doctor podcast. I am your host, Dr. Marissa Caudill, and today in Season 1, Episode 2, I've chosen to talk to you about the number one preventable cause of serious mental illness in kids and young adults that I have seen in my last 17 years as in practice here in California. That is the use of e-cigarettes or vapes to inhale concentrated THC called wax. This process is known as dabbing or use of a wax pen, and it has definitely been dramatically on the rise, I would say, over the last 10 years here in California. And while this is not the most common mental health problem in kids that I've seen, the reason I'm starting with this topic in Season 1, which is all about the top 10 mental health conditions that parents have brought their kids to see me, a child psychiatrist, for, is that the mental illness that vaping THC can cause is really severe. Of course, it's hard to say for sure that mental illness when it occurs in young people is caused by a substance. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say for sure what's the chicken and what's the egg. I don't know how much of a young person's mental health symptoms might be due to their genetics versus their environment and the drugs that they've been using. But I've been practicing for 17 years, and since the introduction of e-cigarettes and the legalization of marijuana here in California, I can tell you for sure the frequency of serious mental illness in young people who are vaping THC has been dramatically on the rise. I'm sure it's still not the majority of young people who are vaping THC, but it's still significant. And for the kids and young adults that I've seen who've had these serious mental health problems, which can be suicidal depression, bipolar mania, psychosis, in most cases, I don't think that the serious mental illness would have happened if it were not for their use of THC. So it's for this reason that I think it's important for you and for me as parents to really understand the prevalence of e-cigarettes and to be able to have conversations that are informed with our children about vaping and to be talking with them about vaping from a pretty young age. And I recommend this in order to keep the lines of communication open between you and your kids. It is known that kids whose parents talk to them about drug use and vaping have an over 50% reduced chance of developing a use disorder. Again, all you have to do is talk to your kids and you will reduce the chance that your kids will develop a substance use disorder by over 50%. So these conversations are vitally important. I can't emphasize enough how we have to not be afraid to talk to our kids about this. And the tone that we take when talking with them about this topic is really important because the goal is to keep the lines of communication open, to be honest with them, and to let them know that they can come to us if they or their friends are ever in trouble. I work really hard to remind myself to focus primarily on what I can control, and I encourage you to do the same. I think this is an important part of our mental well-being as parents. There's a lot that we can't control, right? We might not be able to control where we live or which kids our child befriends or whether those kids have involved parents or whether we live in a state that has legalized marijuana, but we can control whether we are involved parents and whether we keep the lines of communication open on these topics with our kids. And that's what I want to support you with today. So thinking back to Oprah's 3 questions that guide her meetings, what is our intention, what matters, and what's important? That is my intention for this podcast episode. I want to help you talk to your kids about vaping. I want you to feel comfortable about having this conversation, informed, and know how to start the conversation. That involves teaching you something about vaping because if you're like me, you probably don't know much about it. If this kind of thing interests you and you want to learn more, or if you'd like to dive into topics like this more deeply with me, please know that I have a free book club. It happens every month on the 3rd Wednesday. I also have a free weekly newsletter that goes out via email, and you can sign up for either of these on my website, theparentdoctor.com. Okay, let's dive in. What are e-cigarettes? Again, if you're like me, I'm born in 1977. I grew up with people in restaurants, even if I was sitting in the non-smoking section, who were smoking because they were in the smoking section, but they were literally 4 feet away from me. And I remember being on airplanes with my grandmother, who was a smoker, and we would be in the smoking section, but the row in front was the non-smoking section. So way back in the day, our kids probably can't even imagine this, like we really didn't divide smokers and non-smokers. And if you think about it, I think back in the 60s, the statistic is like 40% of people smoked. We knew it was bad for you for a long time before anything actually happened to regulate it. And e-cigarettes have been around only since they were introduced in the US in, I think, 2007. But the device Juul came out that really made them popular in 2015, I believe. So it's only been about 10 years. We have a long way to go before we understand as much about e-cigarettes and their health effects as we do about combustible cigarettes. I mention this because vaping is touted as safe and harmless water vapor that you're inhaling. But again, I don't know if that's really true. I think there's probably some versions of vaping that could be relatively safe. But much of what is out there and much of what kids especially might get since they're underage and they're more likely to be buying things that aren't regulated or on kind of a black market situation, there's risks that they're inhaling things into their lungs that could be really damaging. We also know from animal models that nicotine levels, if we're just talking about nicotine in e-cigarettes, the animals who are exposed to vapor have 8 times as much nicotine in their bloodstream as the animals exposed to cigarette smoke. So you get a much higher nicotine level in the blood, and this has effects on endothelial cells. Those are the cells that line your blood vessels. And we know that e-cigarette vapor with nicotine, again, also can increase risk of cancer in animal models. So we don't know everything about this yet. It probably is healthier than cigarette smoke, but it's certainly not a wonderful thing to do to your body. Now, this doesn't mean that e-cigarettes were invented with any kind of malicious intentions. Like many things that turn out not to be as good as we hoped, they were developed by someone who had really good intentions. The scientist who developed the first e-cigarette was a Chinese man whose dad had died of lung cancer. And he developed it with a goal that it would be something that could help people quit smoking cigarettes. So the goal and the mission with e-cigarettes from the start was a noble one, to be a healthier alternative that would help people wean off of nicotine. From its invention in 2003 and initial introduction in the US in 2007, e-cigarettes really went mainstream, as I said, here in the US around 2015, and that's when a device called Juul, Juul, came out. And it's still one of the most popular e-cigarette brands. If you've never seen one, Google it. It looks almost like a USB flash drive, and it actually recharges itself through a USB charger. The content of nicotine in a Juul device cartridge is the same as the content of nicotine in a pack of 20 cigarettes. So it's marketed as something that will help you know how much you're reducing your smoking as you reduce your use of Juul over time. But here's the difference, and this is important to know. Think about when someone smokes a regular cigarette that you light with fire. You're not inhaling 100% of that smoke, right? You're actually usually inhaling only about 30%. So of all the nicotine that's in that tobacco, your body's only getting exposed to about 30%. So in the pack of cigarettes, your body's only getting exposed to about 30%. On the Juul device, on the other hand, you only inhale it when you push the button, put your mouth on the mouthpiece, and inhale. So 100% of that Juul cartridge's nicotine is getting into your body. And this is where I've had lots of conversations with teenagers who are vaping nicotine through vapes. And when we calculate how much nicotine they're getting exposed to, it's not uncommon for me to have to deliver the bad news to a young person that they are inhaling an equivalent amount of nicotine through their vape that would be like them smoking 3 packs a day. And every time I've had this conversation with a young person, they are just like bug-eyed and slack-jawed and they can't believe it. But these kids get so hooked on nicotine that they will be sleeping with the vapes under their pillow, sometimes waking up at night to hitting it like every few seconds throughout the day. It can be extremely, extremely addictive. And again, for those of us who are older, and remember, like you might have had a grumpy old uncle who, when he didn't get a cigarette, was mean to everybody. Nicotine withdrawal induces emotional distress. And so it's not uncommon for kids who are addicted to these high levels of nicotine to have major emotional meltdowns when they can't get it or when they're not allowed to have it. And this is really tricky. And as a child psychiatrist, it was tricky to have to be, prescribing and having conversations with kids and their parents who were minors about how the parents were going to administer Nicorette gum or nicotine patches to try to help this kid like wean off of the nicotine. Can you imagine those conversations? It was not fun. As parents, I think it's very important that we understand how kids are getting introduced to e-cigarettes and when. Most commonly, kids are introduced at school by a friend who's already vaping. And this is not uncommon to start in middle school. Some studies have shown that about 1 in 20 kids in middle school have used vapes in the last 30 days. It's even more prevalent in high school, where 1 in 5 kids are estimated to have used in the last 30 days. This is based on kids' self-report. And these rates fluctuate over time, and they vary from state to state. So that's, a general number to understand, like, how prevalent is this? The numbers seem to peak in 2019. That was when I was practicing. I definitely saw this. Just over 30% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 had vaped in the last 30 days, way back in 2019. It seems like those numbers are declining a little bit. Like with the pandemic, they went down, but they are coming back up again. So again, it's just something to know that this is happening. And most likely your kids and my kids are going to see their friends or other people vaping around them at school. So that's why it's so important to have these conversations ahead of time so that we can talk to them about, what do they think about it? How does it look to them? And how will they deal with it when someone offers them a hit on their vape? Because it's probably a matter of when and not if. One of the things that makes e-cigarettes really tempting for kids is that there are many flavors that are, candy flavored, fruit flavored, whatever. And so they're very enticing, just like sugary cereals are enticing. It's enticing for kids. And a lot of times kids might be introduced to a vape by a friend who tells them there's no nicotine in this. It's possible to have zero nicotine. It's called juice, right? The liquid that's in the vape that actually becomes vaporized is called juice. So they sell zero nicotine juice, but it's pretty hard to get, actually. It's much more common that you have nicotine containing juice. So one conversation to have with your kids is to let them know, even if someone tells you there's no nicotine in it, be suspicious that there might be, and just let them know how easy it is to get hooked on nicotine and how hard it can be to quit. Many states, and maybe even at the federal level, have outlawed the use of these flavored vapes for the reasons that I just stated, because they're so attractive to minors. But there is a loophole, and that is that reusable vapes might have it outlawed, but the disposable vapes haven't yet been outlawed for those flavors. And there was a conversation with a bunch of, places where they sell this stuff here in California that was on the news recently. And there's basically no enforcement, right? So we have these laws on the books, but then if you're the proprietor of like a 7-Eleven or a smoke shop, there's actually no one enforcing this to prevent you from selling these things. And then now we also live in this digital age where we can all buy stuff online, including our kids, and there's plenty of places online where minors can easily get access to these things. So it's not a matter of difficulty gaining access to it, even though there are laws in place. I want everybody listening to look up what these things can look like, because if you've never seen a vape up close, you may not realize the wide variety of devices and all the appearances that they can have. The disposable vapes that are very commonly used by minors, some popular ones are called Puff Bar and Elf Bar. They're very colorful. They might look like a highlighter or a marker. But there's also this thing called stealth vaping. So if people want to be vaping, but they don't want people around them to know they're vaping, they buy vapes that look like other things. So there are vapes they sell that look like lipsticks. There are vapes they sell that look like smartwatches. There are vapes that look like video game consoles, almost like a Nintendo DS. There's even a tire, like they sell hoodies where the drawstring is a way for people to vape. And this allows the wearer to surreptitiously inhale and then exhale into the hoodie, so there's no vapor visible to people around them. And it's not uncommon for kids to be vaping on school grounds. I talk to a lot of teachers and principals who say that this is something they're kind of constantly monitoring for, but it's really hard to detect. And it's a strong smell, so you might know that a kid has been vaping, but it's hard to know which kid it was if you're just like looking at a classroom full of 40 kids, right? The other thing to know is that kids really like to do tricks with the vapors. So if you see someone using a vape, this happened to me the other day. I was driving in the car. We went by this guy who had a hot pink vape, and he took a hit on it, and he blew it out his nose. And my 7-year-old daughter was in the backseat going, "Mom, look at that guy. He looks so cool. He looks like a dragon." So she was all into the hot pink vape. It's her color, her favorite color. And then my older son was like, "No, Emily, that's bad." But it does look kind of cool, I have to say. I mean, if you imagine yourself as a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid and someone were doing tricks with the vape coming out their nose or blowing vape rings, like smoke rings, blowing the vapors on a table and swirling it with their hands, like it would be very enticing for you. And it will be very enticing for our kids. So it's important to be aware of this and maybe even like watch some of these YouTube videos with your kids. They know what it looks like and talk about like, it looks pretty cool, doesn't it? I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that it does look pretty cool. And then let them know, like, it's pretty likely someone's going to offer this to you. If you had a friend who was doing tricks like that and they said, hey, do you want to try? Like, how would you handle it? Role play with them so they have a chance to think about how they're going to say no, if they're going to say no. And also let them know if they try it, you would like them to tell you so that you can know if and when that happens. And if it becomes something ever for them that is a habit or that it's hard for them to quit, that they come to you before it becomes a big problem. And also you hope that they would come to you if any of their good friends are going through something like that too, right? So that you can help. I want to take a moment to talk about the really scary stuff with vapes, things that could happen. So basically, the vape devices have a cartridge, which is loaded with the liquid. And the liquid might be nicotine liquid. It might be concentrated THC in the form of wax that is very sticky, but it can be placed in an oil that almost is like maple syrup. And then that can be inhaled through the vape device. Or the wax itself can be placed directly on the heating device in a vaporizer and used that way in a wax pen. What you need to know is that wax, THC that's concentrated, is almost 100% pure. It's like over 90% pure. This is in contrast to if a person were actually smoking marijuana plant in the form of a joint or in a bong. That's usually like 20, maybe 27% on the high side. So it's much more concentrated THC. It's like an instant high. People who use it tell me it doesn't feel that different, but it just works faster and it might last longer. What we do know, though, is that the effects on the brain in adolescents are different than the effects on the brain of an adult, meaning a fully cooked brain, a brain of an adult over the age of 25, is less likely to have serious mental health problems from using marijuana, even if they use it frequently, than an adolescent. And the risk for serious mental health problems that are in the general population pretty rare, things like bipolar disorder, psychosis and schizophrenia, suicidal depression, you increase the risk of those things 5-fold. So it goes from about a 1 in 100 risk to a 1 in 20 risk. And that's a conversation that we need to have with our kids because nobody needs to have psychosis. Nobody needs to have bipolar disorder. Nobody needs or wants to have suicidal depression. It is not fun, I can assure you. And it's really sad when I've seen kids who I really think otherwise wouldn't have had these mental health disorders, star athletes, ace students who spend a summer vaping wax with their friends and then are suicidally depressed when school starts again in September and have to be hospitalized. And it really derails their life track for a little while. Similarly, and I think even worse, when it's bipolar mania or psychosis, that can lead to years of being on heavy-duty psych medications to try to reverse the symptoms. And it's hard to know if we can fully reverse it. And even if these kids get better, one thing that I have experienced is that they are susceptible. If they use again, the symptoms come back. I've had high school students who got really sick, got hospitalized. We stabilized them on medications. They went off to college. They used again. They got hospitalized again. So the brain is very vulnerable during adolescence to the effects of THC. Again, not everyone's brain, but some people's brains. And I don't have a test that I can tell you, go get your kid tested to find out if they are at risk. There's no way to know, unfortunately. One thing you can tell your kids is that if they ever do try THC and they experience hallucinations or feeling like things aren't real, that might be a red flag that they are at increased risk. Okay, so that's something to tell them. But again, I don't want you to condone the use in adolescence. I don't think there's any for sure safe amount of THC that kids can use in adolescence. The other scary thing to know is that because the vape cartridge is just like you put a liquid in there, you can put anything in there, it's possible to use other drugs. And people vape methamphetamine, they can vape fentanyl, they can vape kratom. So when kids are using vapes or a friend's vape, they might get exposed to something more than what they think they're going to get exposed to. Your kid may have tried someone's nicotine vape ones and then be at a party and think that's what it is, but it might actually be something much more potent. And it might have, scary side effects for them. And then very rarely, the vape juice can have stuff in it that can be toxic to lungs. And there have been, I think, like close to 70 deaths and several thousand people hospitalized of whom about 15% were minors due to vaping-related lung injury that could be not reversible. So again, like each of us genetically is unique. There's no person exactly like you on Earth. There's no person exactly like me on Earth. There's no person exactly like your child on Earth. And so reminding them that we won't know until we try it, and that might be too late, how a chemical is going to react in our bodies, right? And that's true for how many people might have this big, like, kind of allergic reaction to the content in a vape. I know I've told you some scary stuff right now, like your kid could be given fentanyl or meth in a vape, and your kid could die of lung injury from a vape. While both of those are theoretically possible, neither is likely. And I'm not advocating for a scare your kid straight approach to talking with them about vaping. I just want you to remember that adolescent brains are hardwired to overestimate rewards and underestimate risks. I'm going to say this again. And you know this is true because you were an adolescent once. So adolescent brains are hardwired to overestimate rewards and underestimate risks. You may have blocked out all the stupid stuff you did, but I want you to take a moment right now and think about something dumb you did as a teenager, because I think every teenager does some pretty risky things, but most of us thankfully live to tell the tale. And this is where neuroscience is really important to understand, because even if you have a smart kid, and even if you have a kid who's conscientious, even if you have a kid who respects you and listens to you and you tell them these risks, they still might try vaping because they're an adolescent and they overestimate the reward and underestimate the risk. And when that happens, or if that happens, I don't want you to blame yourself. I don't want you to become furious with them. I don't want you to feel like a failure or for your child to feel like a doomed person because they're just doing what adolescents do. Remember what it was like to be 14, 15, 16. Watch some vaping videos about the tricks that people do and imagine being with friends at a party and seeing your best friend doing some super cool, like vaping, blowing a smoke ring kind of thing. And just imagine how much your 15-year-old self would have wanted to do that too, right? So I think a realistic goal is to aim to have open communication with your kid so they can tell you if and when they try it or if their friends are using. And then you'll know if it's something that you need to get extra help for, like, are they hooked on it? Are you needing to talk to a doctor about getting them off of it? If you tell them, if you ever use this, you know, you're going to go to basically kid jail if you ever do this, or if I find out about it, then your kid is much less likely to tell you what's going on, right? Because they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to get their friends in trouble. That said, I'm not saying that you should condone this in any way. I'm not saying that you should let your kids smoke at home or use THC at home or smoke weed in your basement. No. I know parents who have asked me, like, isn't it better and safer if I just buy it for them and let them use it at home? No. I just told you their adolescent brains should not be exposed to THC at all. So just what I've told my kids is like, and we live in Santa Monica, we smell weed all the time. They know what it smells like. And I tell them, look, lots of people do it. Why do you think they do it? We talk about what they feel, what drives substance use in general. And then we talk about the importance of them waiting until they are adults over the age of 25 if they are curious about that and they want to try it, that I hope that they will wait. And that's all I can do. What I can control is having the conversation with them, educating them, having this conversation at a young age. Before adolescence sets in, your kids are less likely to have a visceral, like, my parent is dumb reaction to the things that you're saying. For those of you who have teenagers, you know that, like, part of adolescence is realizing that your parents don't know as much as you thought that they did. And so you as the parent really go down in your kids' eyes once they hit adolescence. So the important part is having these conversations before our kids hit adolescence and suddenly know everything better than we do. And truthfully, they're going to know probably more about vaping than we do. So even though I've tried to educate myself, the truth is I've never actually vaped and I've never seen someone up close who's vaping. I've never been at a party where someone's loading their vape with THC. I've watched YouTube videos about it. You can too. But I haven't seen what it is. I haven't felt what it is. And therefore, I can't exactly know what my kids might experience if they try that. But what I can do is talk to them about it and let them know that I think it's a bad idea. I hope they won't do it. But if they do, or if their friends do, I hope that they will be safe and contact me or other adults if they use it and if they get into trouble. How can you tell if your child is vaping? Well, we can keep our nostrils open and smell for weird smells, Like I said, a lot of young people are using vapes that smell very fruity. So if you smell something really sweet or really fruity coming from your kid's room, have high suspicion, even if they tell you it was a candle or something else. And with THC in the concentrated forms that people vape, the wax is called wax because it looks like earwax. It's kind of yellowish brown and it's sticky. So if you see a sticky residue on surfaces, that might be a giveaway. If there's an odor, there still is an odor even with the vaped THC that's a little bit like regular cannabis that's kind of stinky and skunky smelling, but it lasts less long. And when vaped, there's less of a permeating odor than when smoked. It doesn't permeate clothing as much. If you notice weird smells coming from your kid's room, be curious about it. If you notice any weird chargers or strange things that look like, highlighters, and your kid's telling you, oh, that's nothing, be suspicious about it. Another thing to look out for is cell phone chargers, like iPhone chargers, can be cut at the tip and the wires can be exposed and then touched onto a cartridge to provide the electricity if the battery on a vape has died. So that's something that I've heard from teachers and principals is often a sign of kind of vaping paraphernalia. Kids will have these exposed wire chargers. So if you see those, be suspicious. And again, the conversation, if you find those things, is to encourage your child to be open with you, to not come down super heavy from the outset, because if you do, they're not going to tell you the truth. Another thing to keep in mind with vaped THC is that it can be as addictive as the nicotine is. I've had young adults, especially, who are hitting a wax pen multiple times a day. And the effects of THC on the body and the mind can be really hard to withdraw from. So THC withdrawal can look like severe disruption of sleep, severe disruption of appetite. Sometimes people get frank nausea that lasts for days, if not weeks. And unlike nicotine replacement, like I can give someone nicotine gum or I can give them a nicotine patch, there's nothing like that that's available as a prescription for THC. And that makes it really challenging. When people get hooked on THC, it's really hard for them to come off because it's very uncomfortable. We can try to manage that a little bit with psychiatric medications, things to help them feel less anxious, things to stimulate appetite, things to help with sleep. But it is very challenging. And I've had not great success for the young people that I have worked with who've tried to get off THC either on their own or through recovery groups or even through residential programs. The chances that they go back to it is very high. It causes just so much physical distress and stomach pain that people feel like they have to stay on the THC. Let's summarize with Oprah's 3 questions again. My intention with this podcast was to help you, the parents, understand that vaping THC is, especially in states where THC marijuana is legalized, it's a very common way that young people are consuming THC marijuana products, and it has increased mental health risk for kids. So I really want you to understand this and be able to talk to your kids about it, maybe even play this podcast with them so you can have a conversation starter and discuss it together. The other thing I want you to know is that e-cigarettes are the most common way that kids are using nicotine these days. What is important is for you as parents to know what to look for, to know the importance of starting these conversations early, to have multiple conversations, and to know that by having those conversations and keeping the lines of communication open with your kids about vaping and substance use, you are reducing their chance of developing a substance use disorder by over 50%. And what matters to me is making sure that as many parents as possible understand that this is a thing. Here's the thing. Most of the kids, almost all of the kids that I would talk to as a child psychiatrist, their parents would have no clue that they were using THC. I would see kids who would tell me, I started this at 13. They're now 16 and suicidally depressed. And now they're using their wax pen like 5 times a day, every day. And their parents have no idea that they're using drugs. Even when I ask the parents leading questions like, do you think maybe any substance use could be going on? Have you seen any signs of this? Do you have any concerns about it? The parents would say no. And as a child psychiatrist, there's these weird laws that prevent me from telling parents about a kid's substance use. I can only just say, like, at some point, I'm recommending that your child go to substance use treatment. And then it usually comes out at that point. But if it's a kid who's seeking help from me and I'm not yet at the point of recommending that they go to a residential program or seek a substance use specialist intervention, if we're going to try to manage it on our own, then that is something that I am not supposed to disclose to the parents. At least here in California, the child's rights are protected to be able to seek substance use treatment without disclosing that to their parents. So don't think that just because your kid sees a therapist or sees a psychiatrist and that person hasn't told you, frankly, outright that your kid is using substances, that means your kid is not using substances. They may be, but the person who's treating them might think that it is at a manageable level and that they don't have to disclose it to you yet because it hasn't reached the point of requiring specialty intervention or being risky for your child's life. It's a lot, isn't it? All right. That's episode 2. Next time, I'm going to be talking to you all about kids and big behaviors. So that's probably the number one thing for young kids that parents come to see me about. And it can be anything from, this kid is always having meltdowns, or they're mean to their sibling, or they disrespect me and yell at me, or they're getting in trouble at school. A lot of kids have big emotions and their brains are still developing and they're learning how to regulate them. And I'm going to give you guys some very useful ways to think about kids' behavior, talk about the psychology of how to shape that behavior, and talk about the neuroscience of how their brains are developing and how this is not something that we have to freak out about. It's all going to get better. See you next time. Take care.